On behalf of the Professional Baseball Strength and Conditioning Coaches Society, I'd like to welcome you to the PBSCCS podcast. I'm your host, Chris Messina. All right, everybody, today's episode of the podcast is actually going to be a year in review. Today marks the 7-year anniversary of the PBSCCS podcast. The first episodes came out way back in August of 2017. I never thought that this would go on as long as it has, or really grow the following that it has, or have the number of interviews that it has, but here we are. So we're going to celebrate a little bit with a year in review. Before we get into that, first I want to say thank you to all of the guests that have given me time, not only in this year, but every year. I know it's really hard to find time in the busy baseball schedule. Even in the off season, there's a lot of stuff going on that kind of takes away any free time. And when you do have free time, you don't always want to talk shop for a podcast. So I'm really appreciative of all my guests for giving me their time and their energy. I want to say thank you to all of the sponsors that have sponsored not only the podcast itself, but the PBSCCS as a whole. And then, of course, I want to say thank you to all of the listeners for the support and the feedback, again, not just this year, but over the past 7 years. This year we had 11 individual interviews, the first being with Taylor Rhodes. We discussed winning the World Series, what that took from him, from his staff, from all the players, from really everybody in the organization, the ups and downs, ultimately, winning the whole thing. And we also discussed training the aerobic base for baseball players. The next interview was with Mia Salvamini. In a very short time, she had been a part of multiple minor league championship teams, and it was really cool to discuss that with her. We did an interview with Drew Widener and discussed being named a Strength Coach of the Year. There was an interview with Phil Hart. We discussed a lot of things. We discussed aerobic training again. We discussed building a system of development in the minor leagues and what that looks like. And we discussed him winning Strength Coach of the Year. We had an interview with Donnie Gress. We also discussed him being a Strength Coach of the Year and kind of took a dive into working the Arizona Fall League. We had an interview with Drew Platts, and we discussed athlete monitoring and his article that he wrote on it for Simply Faster. There was an interview with BJ Foley. We discussed rehab and collaboration within the team and what that looks like to just get players back to health. We had an interview with Connor Rooney where we discussed movement screens and what their organization calls return to peak performance, what that looks like and the process of going about it. We had an interview with Andy King, who has spent the last decade in the same organization. We discussed that. We discussed the camp that they run in San Francisco for some of their prospects. And we also discussed his role as a coordinator and what it takes, to be a part of a staff, to run a staff, and also what he looks for in new hires. There was an interview with Mark Weissman, and we discussed traditional strength training. And again, another look behind the curtain of what it takes to be a coordinator in his organization. And the last individual interview was with Yannick Plant, and we discussed technology. We discussed working different levels of the minor leagues, and we discussed some of the benefits of being in the complex league. There were also 2 group interviews this year. The first one was Have Some Feel with Joe Hudson and Casey Callison. This was a really fun one for me. A lot of people in professional baseball specifically say have some feel, but it's not always easy to explain what that means. And so that episode, in my opinion, did a really good job of just giving some examples of good feel, bad feel, too much feel, not enough feel. So if you're new to the game and you want to know what have some feel means, that's probably a good episode for you. And then the other group episode that we did this year was with Logan Jones and Nate Friedman discussing a blended approach. This was an absolute monster of an episode. It took 3 whole parts. And we discussed really blending the weight room, blending skill acquisition, blending development for players, and combining coaching staffs and athletic trainers and strength and conditioning to really just put the athlete at the center of all of it and trying to get the most out of them. That was, like I said, a really good episode, just a beast, a ton of information in that one. We covered a lot of different themes this year, as mentioned, some of them just rehab and return to play. Athlete monitoring was discussed. A look behind the curtain of what the Arizona Fall League is for a strength and conditioning coach. A couple coaches talked about aerobic system training for the baseball player. Again, I had a couple guys discussing being minor league coordinators, what they look for in their staff, how they develop their staff, what they look for in new hires, that type of stuff. Just, being in charge of an entire department. And then some of the common stuff that we have in every episode, advice for others in the field, whether it be younger coaches looking to get in, older coaches looking to stay on top of things. There's always advice in every episode. In that same vein, there's also a discussion on finding success as a strength and conditioning coach. There's continuing education resources. There's the lightning round, and of course, there's always the best minor league or the best professional baseball story. And that really is just a good way to kind of, kick it off with something funny or something that we're proud of or something that other people can relate to. Overall, this year, we had 12 different organizations represented throughout our interviews. And so, again, I feel really strongly about this past year. I think there was a lot of really good content. And again, this is kind of a niche podcast to the professional baseball setting, but a lot of the lessons learned in professional baseball in these interviews can really, translate to any position that you go to, whether it be college sports, the private setting, football, basketball, soccer, tennis, I don't know, surfing. There's something that anybody can take, and I take a lot of pride in that, being the host of the show. Kind of along those lines, for me, it's been really fun personally just to get to meet a ton of new people. All of my guests have been really great. Like I said, they're willing to give me their time and their energy when, it's not always easy to do that when you have a free moment in the professional baseball schedule. I try to go in and be curious. I try to ask the questions that I'm hopeful that the listeners want answered, but also selfishly, I ask questions that I want answered. I think for me, I'm trying to learn from, other coaches that are in the game and how they do it and how they see things from their unique angles and perspectives. And so for me, it's been, really fun to do these interviews, and it never really feels like work, which is really good. I've had a lot of good friendships come out of these podcasts, and I've been able over the years to kind of watch some of the guests grow and develop, not only in the game, but wherever they decide to pursue in the strength and conditioning field. So if there's anybody that you want on the podcast in the future, please feel free to send them my way. If there's any topics that you want to hear discussed amongst the guests on the podcast, please send them my way. And then maybe specifically, how some of those topics can relate specifically to professional baseball in the setting of professional baseball. Again, just send them my way. I'm always open. I'm always looking for new guests and new ideas. So overall, I just want to say thank you again to the guests, to the sponsors, and of course to all of the listeners for the support, the feedback, the love, the appreciation this year and every year. That's going to be it for today. We'll be back again in 2 weeks with another interview to kick off year 8. And in the meantime, again, one last time, I just want to say thank you. With that being said, we'll talk to you again on the next one.